everyone. So as you said, my name is Tessa, and let's watch some bears. So has anyone here read Persuasion by Jane Austen? Oh, some hands. Awesome. I actually haven't, but I've seen The Lake House, which I feel like is just as good. So in it, Sandra Bullock describes the book like this, for those of you who haven't read it like me. She says, it's wonderful. It's about waiting. These people, they meet, they almost fall in love, but the timing isn't right, and they have to part. Years later, they meet again, and they get another chance, but they don't know if too much time has passed, if they waited too long, to make it work. So Jane Austen and Sandra Bullock have a point. Why is timing so hard? Well, since The Lake House is, in essence, a movie about a time-traveling mailbox, I think timing is a little bit more challenging there than in real life. So for today, let's just focus on the world of View and look into why timing in View can get so complex sometimes. I thought that View was supposed to have this great reactivity system that automatically picks up on and propagates any and all changes so that we don't have to think about it, and smartly re-renders only the components that need to be updated and leaves the ones that don't alone. An aside, if you'd like to learn more about how View sets up that reactivity system and propagates those changes, then you can check out this talk I gave at GDG DevFest New Haven in 2017. But back to when things render. Sometimes you want to be able to hook into that functionality. And you might ask, why? Like, I wasn't really sure before either. But for example, maybe you want to dynamically create new form fields and then as you create them, focus inside them. Or maybe you want to test that after you've added an element to the DOM, see that it's actually been added. As you may know though, a naive approach of simply, for example, dynamically adding an input and immediately trying to focus in it naively will fail. But why is this? And how can we solve these problems? For that, we're going to need a little something called nextTick, and I have the doc definition right here. It says that it defers the callback to be executed after the next DOM update cycle. Use it immediately after you've changed some data to wait for the DOM update. So now that we're all experts on nextTick, just kidding, I think that that's a little bit unclear, but let's set that aside for a moment and cover some core View concepts in case anyone is unfamiliar. Starting with single file components. So this is what a typical component looks like in View. It's divided into 3 sections for our JavaScript, our template, and our CSS. So let's look a little bit closer at that JavaScript section. Inside the scripts tag, we need to export a default object, and that comprises our component. This default object has a bunch of different options. So for example, we have our component state, our computed state, also known as getters, lifecycle hooks, and component methods. So all of these different properties make up our component. And like other popular front-end frameworks, Vue has a plethora of lifecycle hooks available. Today, we're going to be focusing on the ones that are around the create and mount specifically because they consistently run at a predictable time every time we re-render our components. So going back to $nextTick, let's try to figure out what it does by watching it. We're going to print the name of each lifecycle hook in that lifecycle hook, and then pass $nextTick a callback that will print the name of the lifecycle hook again. So with this, what do you think that the print order will be? Will we get a lifecycle hook and then a nextTick and then a lifecycle hook and a nextTick? Will we get all of our lifecycle hooks printed out first and then all of our nextTicks console logged? Who thinks it's going to be the first one? Who thinks it's going to be the second one? Okay, let's find out. It's the second one, but how come? As you can see, $nextTick might be pretty confusing, and there's a bunch of complicating factors that add to that confusion, including that many devs, even experienced ones, don't know that much about how nextTick works. And there's more and more results on Google every year explaining nextTick, but as far as I know, there isn't a single holistic resource that gives you the full picture. Yeah. So today we're going to both leverage and break Vue's reactivity system to help us gain a better understanding of what nextTick is exactly and how it works. Before we continue, note that in Vue, there are both reactive and non-reactive ways to manipulate data. In other words, Vue wraps or decorates or augments certain methods, like, for example, push. And that means that when we interact with data structures such as arrays or objects using reactive approaches, those changes will be noted and propagated to any dependencies by Vue. But on the other hand, if we use these non-reactive approaches, then changes don't get the advantages of that automagical reflow. So let's look at some examples. Here I have an app that renders a new dumpster every time Nexttick fires. And I have a couple of buttons to push two different kinds of bears into those dumpsters. So the clean bear button uses array.push, which is a reactive method to add a bear to the latest dumpster. And the washing bear button uses array indices to add bears. In other words, it uses a non-reactive approach to add bears to the latest dumpster. So as we can see here, adding a clean bear renders because it uses a reactive approach. However, adding a dirty bear doesn't do anything because it uses a non-reactive approach. But maybe if I press it again, it'll work this time. No, unfortunately not. But if I add another clean bear, that should make all three show up, which is pretty interesting. How come? It looks like the clean bears are triggering changes throughout Vue's ecosystem while dirty bears are not. And this includes both state and computed state. Dirty bears do render eventually because the data is still inside the JavaScript. It's just that the Vue part of the JavaScript doesn't detect that a change has occurred until the non-reactive changes get batched in together with the reactive changes. But if you examine the non-reactive changes more closely, like in the console or something, you'll see that they don't have observers attached to them. I covered that a little bit more in that talk that I mentioned earlier. And that may have other implications later on in development. Fortunately for us, though, not today. Let's try looking at Nexttick from another angle. This time, I have 3 buttons. I have 2 for adding containers to bears, and those containers are now dumpsters and tubs, and 1 to put bears into those containers. So tubs get added using array.push, which you'll remember from the previous example is a reactive approach, and dumpsters get added using indices, which is a non-reactive approach. Notice here also, as in the last example, although it didn't matter for that one, that I can't use a computed property for the number of containers I have. So for example, instead of this.barebins.length, I can't have a computed property that returns that length. And that's because the computed property would only reflect the number of containers according to Vue. But if I'm making changes outside of Vue's reactivity system, it won't update those. In other words, I'd only ever be able to add 1 dumpster at a time because it consistently thinks that the length of the container array hasn't changed. Finally, the bear button pushes a bear into whatever the most recently added bear bin is. And notice here as well, I'm not using a computed property, and that's so that I can make sure that I'm inserting bears into the most recently added container, regardless of whether it was added reactively or not. So I'm not discriminating against dumpsters. So when we add the tub, you can see that it gets rendered as we would expect immediately. But on the other hand, when I tried to add a dumpster, it didn't show up until I added the reactive change of a second tub, and then the dumpster sneaks in there together. And now, if I add a bear, you can see it getting added to the newest tub. So let's try a little survey. If I add a dumpster, and then a bear, and then a tub, what do you think we'll see? Is it a dumpster and then a tub with a bear in it? Is it a tub with a bear in it and then a dumpster? Or is it a dumpster with a bear in it and then a tub? Who thinks it's going to be A? How about B? Okay, how about C? Okay, A and B seem about equal popularity, and C is the most popular. Let's find out. So it's C. The bear shows up inside the dumpster. This is because, as far as JavaScript is concerned, the bear really is inside the dumpster. It's just that Vue itself hasn't been notified of the addition of the dumpster or the bear since the bear is in the dumpster and the dumpster is not reactive, so it doesn't know that it needs to re-render. But when we add and render another tub the Vue way, then the dumpster and the bear get an opportunity to slip in. Let's try another one. Okay, we'll do better this time. So if I add a tub, a dumpster, a bear, and a tub, what will show up after the first tub? So that sounds a little confusing, but basically what will show up where this pink rectangle is? Is it going to be A, a dumpster, then a tub with a bear in it? Is it going to be B, a tub with a bear in it, and then a dumpster? Or is it going to be C, a dumpster with a bear in it, and then a tub? This time, who thinks it's going to be A? One brave soul. B? Nobody. C? Oh, everyone thinks C. Okay, let's find out. It's A, the dumpster. Is anyone surprised? No one surprised? Thank you. You should be, because I was just kidding. It actually does show up in the dumpster. Sorry. Got him. OK, so remember, just because we're using Vue doesn't mean that the laws of JavaScript no longer apply. In other words, so long as we're relying on and referring to the JavaScript data exclusively instead of using Vue's wrapped version, and remember that includes the derived or computed data, then JavaScript itself, like separate from Vue, knows what state we're in. In other words, that data option in the default export object really is being mutated. It's just that its changes aren't being automatically propagated until we force that data to be recomputed or reconsidered at next tick. Let's look at one last example. Here we have just one button, and this will add a random number of bears between 1 and 4 to a new dumpster. Although we're adding them reactively, notice here that each bear gets added in a distinct $nextTick callback. However, regardless of the number of bears, they all seem to appear together. And if we turn on paint flashing, which will highlight whatever parts of the DOM get updated in real time, we can see that all the bears really are definitely getting rendered together. Now, if we revisit that method that renders the bears and add a console log in each $nextTick callback, then we can see that $nextTick is definitely being invoked distinctly in each turn of that for loop as we'd expect, but in terms of the render, they're getting bashed and rendered together. That was why, if we can recall this quiz from the beginning of the talk, all of the lifecycle hooks get console logged first, before all of the nextTick console logs get printed together after. So now we know that nextTick batches changes together, but when do those changes run? It's hard to tell from the experiments we've done thus far with the bears and the tubs and the dumpsters. So to understand that, we're going to talk a little bit about event loops. Let's start with nodes, because as far as I know in my research, there seems to be more information readily available about nodes loop processes than the browsers or views. And basically, in nodes loop, we're moving back and forth between JavaScript land and some other land, maybe C, in a cycle until we're done. And so, for example, here, if this works, yes, but where is it? I don't know. There we go. Here, oh no, sorry, I'm very bad at aiming. In the libuv phase, we're going to see if we finished processing any files, and then if we have, we'll run the relevant JavaScript callbacks. And note also that set immediate happens in the event loop only once, all the way over there. But we don't see here when nextTick happens. So if we want to find that out, we're going to have to zoom into one of these JavaScript phases for a closer look, so one of these yellow squares. And surprise, inside the loop, there's another mini loop. So this is where we run something called microtasks, which is a category that includes resolved promises and nextTick callbacks. But notice that with the promise callbacks, only the ones that were there when we first entered this loop get invoked, and then the rest wait for the next time we return to JavaScript land. Whereas with the nextTick callbacks, they get processed at a steady rate. So if you're adding new nextTick callbacks at the same speed as you're processing your nextTick callbacks, you could potentially be stuck in that phase of the loop forever. And since it's blocking, that can be a little bit risky. So that means that every time we're in JavaScript land, we have a chance to process those next tick callbacks right before we leave. But on the other hand, that set immediate only happens once per event loop. So you might have read or heard that some people believe that set immediate and next tick, their name should be flipped. And that's because there are so many more opportunities for next tick to be called sooner than set immediate. That was a lot, but luckily, things in the browser event loop are much simpler, assuming that they run according to spec, which is a problem for someone else's talk. You may be familiar with this presentation by Philip Roberts at JSConf EU about how the browser event loop works. If not, and this information is new to you, I definitely recommend checking it out after the conference concludes. But basically, the relevant idea presented here is that each loop contains one task, and a task is completed when a stack is empty. But what are tasks? They're kind of functions, and they can originate from a number of different sources. So for example, it might be a function that calls other functions. It might be a click from a user on your site, or even a click from an end-to-end test on your site. So as you might guess, tasks don't have a predetermined runtime, which means that event loops don't have a predetermined length. So then the question here becomes not so much when is next tick as it is where is next tick. And to complicate matters even more, in addition to the task queue, the browser also has an animation callback queue and a microtask queue as illustrated here in its event loop. And notice that similar to the node event loop, these three different queues are all processed slightly differently. If you'd like to learn more about this, I recommend checking out Jake Archibald's JSConf Asia talk, which is where I drew these visualizations from. And this is how he visualized the event loop. So basically, I've never pointed on such a large screen before. We're going around here, and the other way. If there's a task, we're going to process it, and we'll keep going around. And if we need to re-render, then we'll go here. And here in the render cycle, there's our request animation frame where all those callbacks get run. And then here's our render phase with our style, layout, and paint. And since his talk mainly focused on request animation frame and when those callbacks are invoked, it makes sense that he took the time to visualize that on his chart. But where would microtasks and next ticks fall here? To answer that question, we're going to leverage this to-do list method that uses fruit. And the idea behind this system, which was not developed by me, is basically if you have a list of things you need to accomplish in the day, you break them up into different fruits in a fruit basket. So if I have one really big task that I have to take care of for the day, or like a larger task that I'm only going to accomplish a chunk of that day, that is an apple. In addition to an apple, I also want to have a couple of lemons or limes. And those are things that I really don't want to do but have to get done, like maybe I have to pay a bill or something. And then in addition to that, I have grapes, which are like quick to polish off, easy little tasks like mailing that bill or something that can make me feel accomplished, like I've gotten something done, even if I haven't completed the apple task per se. So imagine that you want to take a still life photograph of these fruits for Instagram. First, we need an apple, and only one apple, because an apple a day keeps the doctor away, and we want to keep that doctor away. So we have our apple, and since the apple can represent either one task or part of like a bigger series of tasks, that's a great stand-in for our JavaScript task. Then in addition to our apple, we have our grapes for microtasks, and since they're small and relatively low in calories, it's easy to polish off a few quickly and maybe get a bit carried away and overload or loop with microtasks, and remember they can run forever, so we want to avoid this. Finally, filters can represent our request animation frame callbacks, which is where we make any last changes to the way that things will look before we start rendering. Posting our photo in this metaphor will be the equivalent of our render stage, where we're ceding control to Instagram or to the browser to make visible our composition on the page. Since microtasks include promised callbacks, we can assume that they don't need to be in the render half of the loop over here. And since we can run multiple microtasks between tasks, oh no. Well, there. I was going to say pretend, but then I got it. We don't need to put the microtasks over there. So this is probably a pretty good place to put them, because then as we're going around our event loop, we can run multiple microtasks And then when we're done with those, process a task. And then if we need to re-render, we can go, well, pretend that we went all the way around there. But what about next tick? Are those in the same spot as well? Since microtasks include promise callbacks, that's why they were there. But with next tick, things are a little bit different, right? With promise callbacks, we don't necessarily expect to render every time we process a promise callback. But here, if we recall the definition from the documentation, next tick specifically takes place after the DOM update. And the render step is definitely after the DOM update. So maybe next tick can go after the render phase. But if we recall this example from earlier, it seems like the next ticks are definitely running before render, so that's not quite right. So maybe $nextTick runs between layout and paint, and it's a little hard to see, but I put an arrow between. I'm going to give up on the pointer, but it's right there, between the L and the P. But as you might remember from our Instagram metaphor, applying filters or running that request animation frame callback queue is the last step before we cede control back to the browser, so it can't go there. So next tick must be somewhere around here, right before request animation frame. So now you might be wondering, well, if the docs say $nextTick runs after the DOM update cycle, but it feels like it's running before, why is that? And the reason is the DOM update cycle that it's running after is actually the virtual DOM update cycle. That's thrown me off quite a few times. I talked more about this in depth at the Second View Conf US earlier this year, so if you'd like to learn more about that, that video is available online. Now, let's review what we've learned. Microtasks, which includes $nextTicks, are batched together. Microtasks, including nextTick, run in between tasks and before renders. $nextTick callbacks run after tasks and before render, but they also run after the virtual DOM updates. And non-reactive changes can slip in with reactive ones, but do not do this. So why does timing with nextTick feel so complicated? I think one reason it might feel complicated is because when we look at using something like a watcher or nextTick, we're in a frame of mind where we're thinking we have to try to catch a change in time. But I hope after today we can just consider this as looking for changes from a different perspective. So for example, if I'm watching data more directly, then I'm basically saying, OK, as soon as this data changes, I want to run this action. But with nextTick, I'm saying, OK, before I re-render, I want to check if there had been any changes, if that makes sense. If you'd like to learn more or play with the washing bears and add them to dumpsters and tubs like we did in the presentation today, then you can check out that app and more references at this URL. Thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your conference.